Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Tuesday, October the 28th, 2025. A few days ago we did a show with Edward Fishman, a very distinguished government official, academic, about how America is turning the world economy into its weapon of global domination. His new book, Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, suggests that rather than military or intelligence power, American power now is increasingly manifested in terms of economic warfare. He may be right, although there are still a lot of people around, and particularly in the traditional intelligence community, who might argue otherwise. There's a new book out today. It's by my guest, Anthony Vinci. It's called The Fourth Intelligence Revolution, The Future of Espionage and the Battle to Save America. Anthony is joining us now from Washington, D.C. Where else, Anthony, you would be in the heart of espionage, Washington, D.C.? I'm curious. I'm not sure if you saw the show on Choke Points with Edward Fishman, but do you agree with him? Do you think that American power increasingly is being manifested in terms of its economic power?
I did see the show, in fact, and I've read his book, and I would agree that a big part of the competition right now between the U.S. and China is over economics, which makes sense. They can't compete with us militarily quite yet, and so they've tried to compete with us using economics and by stealing IP and trying to harm U.S. or foreign businesses by buying up assets around the world like ports. And actually, I think that intelligence has to keep up with that. And in fact, we need to start doing economic espionage, even though we're extremely uncomfortable with that as a nation. And historically, we are going to have to get comfortable with it because we need to provide information about the global economy, about adversaries and what they're doing to our economy, to the president and other decision makers.
Well, you're a Washington insider. You've worked in and out of government. You're doing a startup now. I'm guessing that what you call economic espionage already exists. I'm sure there are whole buildings in Washington, D.C. dedicated to figuring out how to undermine the Chinese or the Russian or the Iranian economy. Not that Iran has much of economy, but the Chinese certainly do.
I think you'd be surprised. There are definitely economic analysts at Treasury, Department of Commerce, places like that. And even in the intelligence community, there are economic analysts. But the amount of economic analysis that they're doing is much, much smaller than the size of the problem. It's just not proportionate, right? And if you think back to 9/11, and after that, we didn't do a lot of terrorism intelligence before that. We did a little, but after 9/11, we did a lot. And the Counterterrorism Center Forum, the National Counterterrorism Center Forum, the military started doing a lot of intelligence and operations on it, and we went all in. Today, we're in this economic competition, but we're still only doing a little bit of it.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up 9/11. Later this week, we have an interview with Michael Pack, who's just brought out a documentary, PBS documentary on the war, the battles in Fallujah in the Iraq War. Do you see intelligence, and I want to come to the book in a minute, do you see intelligence as competition to military power and indeed economic power, or do you see them all going hand in hand in an ideal world?
Well, in fact, I went to Iraq as an intelligence officer and worked side by side with people in uniform, with people in the military. So I could say as a fact that it is a partnership. And you need intelligence at the tactical level to help find targets and we would say back then define, fix, and then ultimately finish targets. You need it at the strategic level to know if or where you should go to war, or what you should prepare for. So it's definitely a partnership. I think that during times of peace, like during the Cold War or even today, intelligence becomes more important in some ways, because you're not out there fighting wars. You're trying to keep wars from happening, and that's really, at the end of the day, what intelligence does. You try to give information to decision makers to keep us out of war.
Intelligence, of course, is a euphemism, I guess, for spying. We did a show a couple of years ago asking whether spying is an un-American activity. We did it with a historian of American intelligence, Jeffrey Rogue, who wrote an interesting book called The Spy and the State. I'm sure you're familiar with some of his work, Anthony. Your book is on the fourth intelligence revolution. So that assumes, I guess, that there have been three three prior intelligence revolutions. Before we get to the fourth one that you write your book about, what are these first three?
In fact, I agree, and that we are uncomfortable with intelligence. And that's sort of where I start the book, is before World War II, we didn't have a standing peacetime intelligence agency at all. We had done intelligence during wartime. We had briefly stood up peacetime intelligence agencies and shut them down. And sort of famously, Henry Stimson, who was a Secretary of State and Secretary of War, said, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail." And that sort of, I think,
he hadn't read Ian Fleming, had he? All gentlemen seem to do is read other people's mail.
Well, the British did. We saw it as a dirty thing the British did, and we saw ourselves as different than that, in fact. And so World War II, which I call kind of the first intelligence revolution, was a revolution because we stood up this centralized agency. It was called the OSS, and we actually learned how to do that spying from the British, from MI6 and so forth.
And in fact, Ian Fleming, who of course authored the James Bond books, he was very much involved in that.
Very much.
Fleming was close to the Kennedys. I know Jack Kennedy in particular found Fleming a brilliant writer.
Mm-hmm. He was a real intelligence officer. Yeah.
Coming back to your point, it's a very interesting point about America not having an intelligence operation before the Second World War. Again, I'm not going to call you on this because I don't know enough about it, but we have done shows in the past about how even in the revolutionary times, Americans had intelligence officers who were spying on the British. So I assume you had spies, maybe not formal intelligence operations. But would it be also fair to say, Anthony, that before the Second World War, America wasn't really much of a military power? The size of its standing army wasn't larger than that of Portugal or Sweden. So as a non-military power, one wouldn't necessarily have expected America to have much of an espionage operation, would one?
We absolutely had spies. George Washington, in some ways, was a spy master. And like I said, it was really just about wartime for us. We did reconnaissance and things like that. We use intelligence in war. Absolutely. It was peacetime where we started getting uncomfortable. And in peacetime, you use intelligence for diplomacy and things like that, or economic espionage. And that's really where we started to get uncomfortable. And sometimes we pushed it off.
You're speaking the royal we. Who are we?
I think America. I think America kind of the way the American society and people in government thought about intelligence.
You brought up the OSS, which of course was the organization prior to being called, I guess, the CIA. Given America's role after the Second World War, which it fell into, it was an unavoidable role in the Cold War in many ways. Was the OSS and then the CIA, were they inevitable? I know J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the FBI, of course, for many years, was very hostile to both the OSS and the CIA, saw them as a kind of rival. Was there an inevitability about the appearance of the OSS and the CIA?
Not of the OSS. You're right. The FBI did not like the idea and wanted the OSS not to operate in North and South America, in fact. And the military didn't necessarily want them either because they wanted to have their own intelligence. And the Joint Chiefs wanted that. And the president, though, Roosevelt, wanted there to be a centralized intelligence function. And so he really was the one who created it. But then Truman stood down the OSS after the war, and he said kind of famously he didn't want there to be an American Gestapo, and so the U.S. turned the OSS off, and then in 1947 the U.S. created the CIA because the Cold War was coming. We're going up against the KGB and organizations like that, and I think decision makers at that time realized correctly so America was going to need its own peacetime, professional, very large and sophisticated intelligence agency to deal with that conflict.
Anthony, would it be fair to say that Harry Truman may have also been uncomfortable with the idea, this son of a shopkeeper from Kansas, of course, a man of the people, for better or worse. He was uncomfortable with the OSS, maybe in part because it was a surveillance organization, but also because it was a network of gentlemen who went to Yale and Princeton and did secret handshakes and all the other things that upper-class spies do.
Potentially a little bit, although Bill Donovan, who ran it, was Irish, and at that time, I would say the Irish were not considered to be part of the elite in America, although he was a lawyer and a fairly famous lawyer at that. But
unless your last name, of course, was Kennedy.
It's true, but the OSS, though, it did have a lot of that upper class kind of Ivy League, components to it. Some people called it oh so social because it sort of involved people in the social register. But Donovan would also just bring in anybody who had skills that he needed. He would go get safecrackers and magicians and people who knew all these things that so-called gentlemen didn't really know about, and he brought them into the organization as well. He even brought in surfers from California, and that's where he created a maritime unit and got these surfers at Santa Monica and Venice Beach.
That is very cool. I didn't know that. So yeah, we could compare and contrast J. Edgar Hoover's FBI G-men, all wearing suits, all very hierarchical and obedient, with the OSS, and then maybe even the CIA, which was made up of adventurers, risk takers, what today we would call perhaps entrepreneurs. You're the CEO of a startup yourself. So is there a spirit of innovation perhaps in the early days of the OSS and even the CIA?
Absolutely. I would say innovation and creativity and maybe a little bit of ruthlessness and just kind of get the job done attitude. And that really goes back to Donovan. Donovan was ready to personally go on the battlefield. He wanted to be there where the action was. He would try anything. He would pull people, like I said, out of prison who knew how to crack a safe to teach his guys how to crack a safe. Like, he would do anything that would get the job done. And that continues all the way to today. Even when I went to training in intelligence and I went to the farm, there was still that sort of attitude. But combined with,
explain what the farm is.
The farm is the training class where you learn to be a case officer, which is somebody who spots and assesses and handles sources. So it's often what people think about when you think about what it is to be an intelligence officer.
And is that near Langley? Is that a farm connected with Langley in some way, or something else physically?
As I was instructed to say in my book, the farm facility is in Southern Virginia, and that's all I can say.
Well, that gives us an idea, Anthony. On the West Coast, the farm refers to Stanford University. Maybe there's a connection. So were guys sort of upper-class English snobs like Graham Greene, were they wrong to think that American spies were incompetent? In Quiet American, for example, he seemed to suggest that Americans really had no idea what they were doing. John le Carré picks that theme up too. Were these early American spies like Donahue, were they quite competent? Did they compete with James Bond, Ian Fleming, John le Carré? George
Graham
Smiley.
Greene.
There's no American George Smiley, is there?
Yeah, Graham Greene kind of famously being a spy himself. I think in World War II, my kind of read of the situation was OSS was a bit kind of cowboyish and a bit amateur. And there's there's kind of a phrase associated with them, which was glorious amateurs. And I think that's probably about right. And that's really where this second intelligence revolution came in, is after World War II, we got very good at it. And we
Right. So we
really
have the first one, which is
professionalized
the amateur
intelligence.
one of Donahue. You've written a book on the fourth intelligence revolution. Let's talk about the second and third revolutions before we get to the subject of your new book.
Yeah, that second revolution was really started with the formation of the CIA and then other agencies, DIA, NRO, NSA, and it was the professionalization of intelligence in America to fight this Cold War. And that worked well for years, and we got very, very good at it. We spent huge sums of money on it. I think in that time became better at it than MI6 or essentially anyone else in the world. Mistakes were obviously made, and
There were
was a lot of
spies, of
blowback.
course. You've had some famous spies within the NSA and the CIA. We've done shows on that too.
Spies
Russian
like
spies,
Mole,
Soviet
yeah,
spies, that is.
absolutely. I mean, that was the nature of that intelligence conflict in many ways, was to try to spy on each other's agencies and collect that
Well,
intelligence.
although
And
to be
we
fair
did
to
it
the
to them.
Americans, when you compare the US and British intelligence, you never had a Philby or a Burgess or a McLean, really, did you?
Maybe not quite as famous, but definitely there were several situations where a lot of American secrets were let out by spies who were recruited by the KGB.
And of
Unfortunately,
course, it was very much a Soviet versus American operation. So that's the second. We have the routinization, the bureaucratization of American intelligence to make the CIA probably in some ways not profoundly different from the FBI or other government organizations. So what's the third revolution?
so ironically, in that second revolution, we in some ways became too good at it, and we so compartmented intelligence that when 9/11 happened, it slipped through the cracks because our agencies were too rigid. We were keeping everything so secret that the FBI and the CIA didn't talk to each other. Nobody worked with each other, and that's what allowed 9/11 to happen. And after 9/11, we had to have this kind of third revolution where we opened up intelligence and created what some people refer to as a whole of government approach, and something that's now called the intelligence community. And now intelligence agencies were working with all sorts of other agencies, with FBI, with Department of Treasury, all over the government to try to go after this new enemy, which was Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations that were so networked. They were operating internationally. They were operating domestically. They were crossing all these lines. We now had to kind of take this new approach, this networked approach to intelligence.
That's interesting. Who championed this third revolution after 9/11? Were there, we associate obviously the FBI with J. Edgar Hoover, the beginnings of the OSS with Donahue. Were there government officers? Were there romantic figures or maybe even presidents who championed this? And of course, Bush too was president at the time. Did he get behind this? Was it a Cheney thing?
If anything, I would point to the 9/11 Commission report, because that's where we looked at what went wrong. How did 9/11 happen? How did this attack slip through the cracks? How come we didn't connect those dots? And that commission really showed, convincingly so, that it was this compartmentalization that was at least partly to blame. And the solution to that was getting these agencies to work together, ultimately creating a director of national intelligence that sort of sat over them, creating this intelligence community,
Who was
sharing information.
Who was the first director?
Oh, I've forgotten off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's the wrong answer. You just said I can't reveal that.
Yeah, it's classified. I'm sorry, I can't
Classified. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
we'll find out. Someone will tell us. So, in a way, going back to 9/11,
I think it was Dennis Blair. I believe it was Dennis Blair.
So, not a particularly well-known figure. Going back to 9/11, that was a world, of course, where for all the tragedy of 9/11 and the recognition that the intelligence agency had screwed up, this was still a unipolar world, a world where America dominated the world. Is what's happened since 9/11 over the last 20 years, Anthony, this fourth intelligence revolution, is it in part a reflection of the fact that we're increasingly living in a multipolar world, a world where obviously Russia has reinvented itself as a military power, a world of China in particular, so that America has had to adapt to a new world where it doesn't dominate in every sphere?
Well, I would say that these revolutions are driven by two things. One is who's the enemy? Who's the adversary at that
Right.
time? In World War II, it was the Nazis in Japan. Cold War, it was the Soviet Union. 9/11, it was terrorist groups like Al Qaeda, and that really was a big driver. But the second thing that drove these revolutions was technology. And there were a lot of new technologies, especially World War II. We had the radio, and Cold War, we had satellites. So these agencies, everything had to adapt to that. Post 9/11, it was things like networking software. It was things like the cell phone. It was things like the internet that sort of drove these new needs. And those two factors, a new geopolitical enemy and new technology, is what's driving this fourth revolution.
So is this revolution here? Is it something that's arrived, or is it in the process of being made? Are you writing, suggesting that we need a fourth intelligence revolution? The subtitle of the book is The Future of Espionage and the Battle to Save America. Very dramatic subtitle. Sometimes authors duck behind their publishing houses and say that wasn't mine. But are we really in a battle to save America, Anthony?
I think a little bit of both. I think that we are in the midst of it happening, and it's still to come. And I believe that part of the reason I wrote the book is to push us a little faster into this revolution, because I am worried that if we don't transform fast enough, we could potentially lose the battle, and that would harm American citizens, Western citizens, and our interests.
So what is it? What is the fourth intelligence revolution? You've already talked about the technology of the internet, networking, social media, which drove the third intelligence revolution. Is the fourth one all about AI?
Yeah. So I think the two factors driving it are artificial intelligence and the geopolitical conflict with China. And those things, we just cannot understate how transformational both those factors are. And this fourth revolution is going to be marked by three things. One, intelligence is going to expand and is expanding radically. And like I was saying before, it's going to expand into the economic domain. It's going to expand into science and technology areas and things like that. Places where the government and intelligence in particular has not traditionally really operated as much. The second thing that's going to happen is AI is going to do essentially everything in intelligence. It's going to collect information. It's going to analyze information. It's going to disseminate that information. And it gets to a point where really we're going to have AI spying on other AI. The machines are going to spy on the machines, our machines versus Chinese machines. The third facet, and to me, the scariest, in some ways, most important aspect of this fourth revolution is that everyone is now becoming a target of intelligence. Whereas a lot of intelligence used to be about spying on generals or presidents or military sites. Now, more and more, it's China and other actors spying on regular American citizens, collecting data, performing information attacks and against them in cognitive warfare. And that means that we must both kind of protect the average American citizen. Intelligence officers now need to see them as a target, but also everyday people, all of us, have to start to think like intelligence officers and in some way become sort of civilian intelligence officers and start to protect ourselves a little bit and learn some of the tools of intelligence, just like we did for cybersecurity, for example, where we all know a little bit about that now. We change our passwords. Well, we're going to have to do kind of the same thing to protect ourselves because we're all the targets of intelligence.
Yeah, it sounds to me rather science fictional and absurd, but maybe you're right. We've done many shows on China with hawks, with critics, with liberals in some ways. We did one, for example, on Red Carpet by Eric Schwartzel of the Wall Street Journal about how China is buying Hollywood for its own propaganda. We have an upcoming show with Eva Du, who has a new book out called House of Huawei, which is about the growth of Chinese technology companies. But I still don't get, and you know, I'm not denying that America is in some ways competing with China. But what value do the Chinese, for example, what value would the Chinese have in my data? Why should I care? Why would they even want to hack my emails? Or what I'm doing with my banking? Or it's just, I just don't get it. It sounds to me like a level of hysteria, a way of whipping up paranoia about the Chinese that will turn everybody into intelligence officers. We can all play at James Bond. There's only one James Bond, or maybe a few James Bonds.
Well, look, I think that China, like I said, needs to compete with America asymmetrically, right? They can't go toe-to-toe militarily, and so they have to come around.
What does it mean, go toe-to-toe? I mean, you mean they can't fight a nuclear war?
Could fight a nuclear war, potentially. I don't think anybody wants that, but there's no possible way China could invade America or something like that. We just have more weapons.
But China doesn't want to invade them. Why would China want? Nobody would want to invade America, given the amount of guns they're here.
No, but there's a level of deterrence. I think we're probably agreeing with each other that military war is unlikely. And so how do you compete? And what are the ways that you can compete in America is you can try to change what governments do. And in America, we have voters, and voters determine who's elected, both literally by voting, but also by pressuring people in government. And so you can use attacks by collecting information about voters and American citizens, and then try to influence what they're doing, which ultimately influences what the government's doing.
So are you saying that, I mean, it sounds very far-fetched, very as if Ian Fleming could have written it, or maybe a digital version of Ian Fleming. Are you suggesting that the Chinese are collecting individual American citizens' data in order to control its politics?
Well, we can look at some facts about TikTok, for example. It's well established. The Department of Justice has sued them for collecting Americans' data, including children's data. There have been
children don't vote, so why would they want children's data?
Well, even scarier is you might take a generational approach to this kind of control. Start to change opinions now while they're young.
Absurdly paranoid, Anthony. So you're telling me that there are government officers in Beijing who are collecting data on American children because they're taking a generational approach?
Yes. Unfortunately.
Do you have evidence of that? Or is this just a
suspicion? that you're asking me whether that's my opinion. I do believe that is the approach. But on TikTok, it's not just that they're collecting the data. They are censoring it. That's been shown by researchers.
In what way? So, I mean, it seems to me TikTok's just a network of short video, mostly, or the vast majority of inane short videos of teenagers wasting their time, no different from Instagram or other social media networks. Why?
It's importantly different in the sense that it's not owned by an American company, and there are researchers at Rutgers that showed that systematically you can look at the number of mentions of Tiananmen Square or the Uyghurs, for example, on TikTok, and compare that to other US social media sites like Instagram, and it shows that it is censored. So you can compare.
There may be some truth to that. There may be some truth to that, but that's another argument, and that's another story from the Chinese, quote unquote, given that who even knows who's running TikTok. The Chinese using TikTok to undermine American democracy or invade America or compete in an intelligence war.
One more study from the same group showed that not only is it being censored, but the longer a user is on TikTok, the more likely they are to believe that the Chinese is more benevolent in terms of human rights than someone who's not on there. So this is
Well,
not
I mean,
just
you're
that they're
pointing to
censoring it,
one
that
group
it's
from
working.
Rutgers. I haven't seen the report, so I'm not gonna get involved on that. But it sounds really paranoid. I have to admit that the idea that we're all intelligence officers now and we're all fighting against the Chinese.
It's no more paranoid than that someone is likely right now trying to probably hack into your computer to get your credit card number or something like that because there's money on the line. And
It's
so
much less
it
paranoid, Anthony. I mean, I know why people would want to do that, because they want to steal my money. Why would Chinese intelligence want to hack into my data?
if they wanted to change who you voted for. Same reason that the Russians had an information attack on the 2016 election.
But there was
They wanted to
paranoia about that, and it seems as if that was mostly hysteria. That wasn't actually true. So aren't you just creating more hysteria that the Chinese are behind Trump's victory or Trump's defeat? It's not even clear to me who the Chinese would want to be in power. Would they have favored Harris over Trump? Who knows?
It may be I don't necessarily want to speak to who they might want to favor over one or the other, but definitely the weakening of societal bonds, for example, is beneficial to the Russians or the Chinese. And so creating a disruption in many ways, that's what the 2016 information attacks were about. It's not just picking a side, but getting everyone riled up. And
But
that is
isn't
part
that
of the
what
goal.
US and Western intelligence officers, they do the same thing? They try to promote the opposition in Russia or China.
Uh,
I mean, that's
uh,
the old game. It's not the new
wait,
game. It doesn't seem any different now than it's ever been.
Sure, America has a history. Even during the World War II, Donovan would go hire ad men from Madison Avenue in New York and use them to create propaganda. And so there is this history in America. I think what's changed now is the tools, the internet, social media, and AI in particular, and that that has kind of evolved what's possible. It's made it possible to target individuals in a way that didn't used to be possible. And, to your point, are we doing it? Yes. Are they doing it? Yes. Should we do it? Yes. I mean, this, I think, is what national security is about, is
You
defending
keep on
people inside.
mentioning AI. It's a very generic term. It's become like communism. If there's no communist under every bread now, there's AI. What exactly do you mean when you talk about AI being used? I mean, how are the Chinese, for example, using AI to influence how we vote, which is what you said?
Yeah, you're right. You're right to bring that point up. AI means a ton of different things, and it's used, for example, to analyze satellite imagery, right? And that's how we used it at one of the agencies I used to work for at NGA. And it's likely how the Chinese and lots of other countries use it as well. And there's all sorts of forms of AI. One I would point to in particular for China is that they have created a large surveillance state where they're collecting data on their people. This is sort of well established through cameras, through internet connections. Everything is tracked, and they do use AI to monitor what people are doing. And my belief and my argument in the book, in many ways, is that they are attempting to expand this surveillance state approach to the U.S., and it explains why every time you turn on the news, you see that there's another massive hack of U.S. Data. For example, recently there was the Salt Typhoon hack that was uncovered, where it was shown that China likely gained access to almost every American's cell phone. Almost all of us had our data stolen in one attack, which is crazy to think about. And
Yeah,
AI
you talk
can
about
be
the
used.
Chinese. Again, it sounds to me
Well,
like fiction. I mean, you don't have any proof that it's the Chinese. Also, I think there's a fundamental weakness in this argument. I take your point, and we've done many shows on this as well, on the kind of surveillance state that the Chinese are putting together. But they have the power to do that because they can watch their citizens and punish them accordingly. They can take their jobs away. They can punish them financially. They can expose them socially. They can embarrass them in one way or the other. They can't do that in the United States.
Well, they can't because we push back to make sure they can't. So if they own the same assets here as they did there, so if they controlled social media sites, if they controlled cloud computing, if they controlled the places where information happens and how it's transmitted, if they controlled media organizations, absolutely, they could do exactly the same thing. And I think that's sort of my point, and the point in the book, and the point of people who are trying to make TikTok banned or transferred to American hands is that this is what could happen if we allowed it to happen, and we need to stop that from happening, and we need to, and there are other possible ways they can do this, so that we haven't.
So are you saying,
it.
and I come back to the red carpet boy, are you saying that the Chinese shouldn't be allowed? And the Chinese, I don't even know what that means, because there's Chinese capital, there's Chinese venture investment, there are wealthy Chinese people, there's the Chinese government, and it's very hard to know where the government ends and where Chinese business begins. Are you saying that China shouldn't be able to buy Hollywood studios? Are you saying that a company like Huawei should be banned from the United States? Are you saying that TikTok should be nationalized by the Americans? Are you saying all those things?
Yeah, just to be clear, when I say China, I mean their government enterprise, the Chinese Communist Party that controls it. I'm not really speaking about individual Chinese citizens any more than, when we talk about America, I'm speaking about individual. I'm saying the government and what they do. And you're correct to say that it's very hard to say where the government starts and where a company begins, and that's on purpose. They own many of their companies, state-owned enterprises, and even those they don't own, they have a significant level of control. And so, no, I don't believe that Chinese companies like those that are state-owned or have control by the Chinese Communist Party should be allowed to own assets in America, in particular, media assets, information assets, data assets, technology assets like Huawei, like TikTok, which could be used to harm American interests.
Later this week, we're doing an interview with Mike McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He has a new book out, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. I think you and he, and the two books, your new book, The Fourth Intelligence Revolution and Autocrats versus Democrats, you probably wouldn't fundamentally disagree, and you probably cover some of the same themes. But McFaul, as a former ambassador to Russia, knew Putin very well, and as a Russia expert, teaches now at Stanford, focused pretty much in our conversation. We talked a little bit about the Chinese, but he focused pretty much more on the Russians. It's interesting in this conversation, Anthony, maybe I'm leading you down the China path, that you haven't said much about the Russians. They're the troublemakers. They're the ones who invaded Ukraine. China hasn't invaded Taiwan. Why wouldn't we be more concerned with the Russians, who also, from a technological point of view, are quite sophisticated? And there's certainly, it seems to be as much evidence that the Russians are interfering in American life as the Chinese.
Absolutely. I'm concerned about any autocratic adversary of America. That includes Russia, that includes Iran, that includes North Korea. Any government like
Iran,
that.
Israel, would you include Israel? Some people see Israel as an American enemy. Or Canada, or Greenland, or I don't know. It's
no, I think those are
what day of the week we're talking to Trump. There are different enemies every day.
I think those are democracies and absolutely allies. But the difference is, and the reason I definitely talk about Russia in the book, but the reason I primarily talk about China is it's so much more powerful. And I think the reason you see them doing less is that they're much more subtle, and they play a long game. And the Russians are willing to stir the pot and mix it up and do things like send GRU assassins to England to kill their enemies. I mean, literally do stuff like a James Bond villain might.
Yeah, the old-fashioned way. That was your second intelligence revolution, rather than the fourth.
And in some ways, they're still in that revolution, although they They have learned to stir chaos in a way now that is working for them. China is much more subtle, and it plays a long game, and it plays through economic instruments like these social media sites, which is different than Russia. If you look at the 2016 Russia hack and using the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, they were using our social media systems and putting the information attacks onto Facebook and so forth. China sort of skipped that part and said, well, we just have our own social media platform. And then we can not only determine what's on there, we can kind of secretly control it because there's no oversight and put whatever we want on it.
So are you suggesting that all social media networks in China have been created in order to spy on America?
It's no one can say what happened sort of behind the scenes, but I could definitely see a scenario where the Chinese Communist Party, the MSS, their version of the CIA, wanted to have these sorts of assets to do information operations, and potentially helped companies like ByteDance that owns TikTok to expand into America, or at a minimum, certainly didn't stop them, in order to then use them for these kinds of operations.
The Chinese certainly very good in the long terms. The famous Zhou Enlai quote when Henry Kissinger asked him what he thought of the the French Revolution, he said, too early to tell. So you're right, I think, on the Chinese having a long game. But again, I mean, all this is very, very speculative. There are concrete things out there. We did a show recently with the New York Times reporter, Ken Vogel. He has a new book out, Devil's Advocates, The Hidden Story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington insiders on the payrolls of corrupt foreign interests. Anthony, I mean, the Chinese have a lot of money. They can buy lobbyists in DC. Why do they need to use these social media sites? As Vogel says, American enemies now are buying up Washington. Some of them seem to be rather close to Donald Trump, and they were close to Hunter, to Biden through his son. So why does this need to be so sophisticated?
I think that was the case for a while, and they were going and using mechanisms like that, like lobbyists or working with American companies. And then, for maybe the last 7 or 8 years, people in the Washington, D.C. area have kind of figured out that China is predatory and is against U.S. interests, and have become concerned, and so have started to close off those paths. And so China's had to move to other paths to do this, including some of the ones that we were just talking about.
Yeah, as I've made it clear, I'm deeply skeptical, and I'm also troubled by this hawkishness on China. It just seems the beginning of another Cold War, but maybe that's the subject of another conversation. Anthony, you yourself, you've said that we all need to become intelligence officers. You're a former intelligence officer, but now you're starting your own tech startup named after Giambattista Vico, 17th century or turn of the 17th century famous historian, social scientist. You're starting Vico Technologies, applying AI and social sciences to solve problems. And some of those problems, I assume, are intelligence related. What exactly are you doing at Vico Technologies, and why might that be a model for other American citizens if they buy your argument that the Chinese are ubiquitous and want to get into all our data?
Well, my company isn't necessarily focused on these kinds of intelligence issues. What I'm focused on is that I think the world is a very, very complicated place, getting more complicated, and it's becoming harder and harder to even make decisions about what to do. If you're a business, or even if you're a regular person, everything can change tomorrow. Maybe tariffs change. Maybe we go into recession. Maybe China cuts off rare earths.
Anthony, isn't it? I mean, sorry to jump in here, but I don't think it's any more complicated now than it's ever been. Stuff changes.
And well, what's different now is that you can build tools, and the tools that we're building are tools to help people make better judgments, make better decisions using artificial intelligence by doing things like forecasting, by doing things like running scenarios. And these are things, look, Have people been able to do this? Yes, you could have hired, 5 years ago or 20 years ago, you could hire McKinsey to help you make a decision, or you could have
If
hired,
you were stupid enough to
and
pay them,
yeah,
their
or
ridiculous costs.
or you can consult with Henry Kissinger, 50 years ago. But what's amazing about artificial intelligence is what I'm fascinated by is you can take those kinds of capabilities and put them into anybody's hands, into an individual, into a small business, and you can do it at a scale and speed that didn't used to be possible. And that's really kind of what I want to do, is democratize these kinds of capabilities that maybe only presidents and CEOs of major companies used to have.
Well, there you have it. Intelligence is being democratized like everything else, according to Anthony Vinci, at least, in the fourth intelligence revolution, the future of espionage and the battle to save America. We all need to become James Bonds, or at least mini James Bonds. How far does your James Bond go, Anthony? Do you still eat in Chinese restaurants? Should we trust anything Chinese these days?
I'm certainly not as paranoid as I think that this is coming across. I'm looking at this from the perspective of big companies, big agencies in China, and at that level, I think it's prudent and it doesn't hurt to be cautious, even as an individual, and just ask yourself, is there, why is my data being stolen, and what can I do to stop it? And if I'm using an app, like, who owns it and what might they do with it? And I think those are prudent questions to ask, but it doesn't necessarily mean being paranoid all day. And it certainly doesn't mean having a concern with Chinese people. I eat Chinese food all the time. I actually am a big tea drinker, and I import high-end teas from China all the time. I have no beef with Chinese people. I'm just talking about an authoritarian, what is at the end of the day an authoritarian government. And I think it's prudent to treat them as such and make decisions prudently.